In this video, I will talk about the impact multi or bilingualism can have on the mind and brain. So how does multilingualism affect the functioning of the mind and brain? The experience of learning and using another language can fundamentally change the brain in two ways. We believe that the interaction with the environment changes. So if we have the environment here with multiple pictures, someone that speaks Spanish or that knows a little bit of Spanish will activate this language. But for a Spanish Catalan bilingual, these photos might actually activate different languages. So if we look at the flamenco dancer and the Spanish flag, Spanish is activated. But when they see the Sagrada Familia, which is in Catalonia, they might actually activate the Catalan language. In a similar way, for Spanish Valencian speakers, the paella that you see on the bottom might activate Valencian, as the paella is originally from there. The other way we think that multilingualism can change the brain is by its functioning. So basically, if we are speaking many different languages and practicing these different languages and switching between these languages, we are training the brain, its functioning becomes better, and this might change the overall brain functioning. So let's have a look at the first question. So if we look at the environment, do multilinguals and monolinguals perceive the environment similarly? So as from the previous example you can expect, the answer is no. The environment provides useful hints to speak in a specific language. Now these can be linguistic cues, so if the Catalan-Spanish bilingual is in a supermarket and sees all the names of the vegetables in Catalan, it is more likely that Catalan is activated. But it can also be about the topic of a message. So for example, one language that is spoken at home and another language is spoken at school. So if topics related to home are talked about, then most likely the home language is more activated. Next to linguistic cues, we can also have cultural cues. So when we are talking about soup and you see the picture on the right, so a tomato soup, then it's more likely that a student will activate their language related, that is a European language. Well, if they see the soup on the left, then Chinese language like Mandarin or Cantonese might be activated. So other types of cultural objects are the Eiffel Tower, and we can also think of faces. So faces can have a cultural cue suggesting which language to activate, but it can also be about knowing a specific person. And if you know that this person speaks a specific language, then also this language becomes more active. So I already suggested that faces can be hints. So let's imagine a German student, native speaker of German, that is learning English. Now, for native speakers, their language is always automatically more active, and therefore it will be easier and quicker to respond in the native language. Now, if you are surrounded by faces of Germans, so Angela Merkel here, or your students in the classroom, then your German becomes more activated. But when you're suddenly provided with faces like Joe Biden that are only speaking English and not German, then the English might become more activated, and therefore it might be easier to start speaking in English. What we suggest is that the environment can change the language mode. So you can be in a language mode that's more German or more English or any of the other languages that you speak. Now the same bilingual can change between these different types of language environments. So if we are looking at a Ukrainian, they would be speaking a language at home, but then when they were forced to move to one of the other European countries, they might now not just be speaking their home language, but they might be using English or another language, and then switching between these two languages. So they moved from a monolingual to a bilingual situation. Now this doesn't just happen over the long run, but it can also happen on a daily basis. So maybe speaking just one language at home, but when going to work or when arranging paperwork, using both languages simultaneously. Now, while multilinguals can rapidly change between language contexts, everybody changes between different situations. So let's take the example of a driver of a car. When you're driving on a highway, the only thing you need to focus on is to make sure you're staying on the road and keep your end goal in mind. But now when you reach your destination and you're in the city, suddenly many different things are happening at the same time. You have many different options of directions of the road. There can be pedestrians, cyclists that you need to watch out for. So now you're suddenly in this situation with many different cues that you need to consider. Now, do these changes in language mode, so when you're moving from a monolingual to a bilingual situation, impact the functioning of the brain in a more general way? This was tested in an experiment where we measured brain activity, specifically on the following electrodes, and participants were asked to decide whether the center arrow was pointing to the left or the right. So they saw 5 arrows and they needed to decide whether the arrow in the middle pointed to the left and the right. They did this task while in between they saw either Catalan or Spanish or both languages intermixed. Now what we saw is that when we showed them in between only Catalan words, there was a peak in brain activation about 400 milliseconds after they did the task. This peak suggests activation of alertness. So basically, you're ready to go. Now, what happens when they're doing the same task with the arrows, but now they see Spanish words? We see exactly the same type of activation and alertness or readiness to go when there's Spanish word presented. But when we showed them both sometimes Spanish, sometimes Catalan words in the green line, we actually see an increase in alertness. What this is suggesting is that bilinguals are aware of the different cues in their environment, which makes them realize they need to be ready to respond to these changes. And therefore, the readiness to respond to this alertness is higher. Now, people don't realize this themselves, but we see it in their brain activity. So their brain mechanisms change depending on the language situation they are in. So sometimes it is necessary to switch when you're being told to switch. And is it effortful to switch when the environment requires so? Yes, bilinguals have a cost to switch languages. So let's say we're naming pictures in different languages. And if the square around the picture is red, we have to name it in English. So here we say flower. Then when the square around it is blue, we have to name it in Polish. So here we have to say jabłko. This is a switch language trial. And then sometimes they can stay in the same language, saying Jaba here. What we see is that it costs more time to switch to a new language than to stay within the same language. And everybody has a cost to switch tasks. So similarly, if we see a red line around a green circle, the red line indicates to make a decision about color. In this case, they have to say green. And then if the line is blue, they have to make a decision about shape, so oval or triangle. And also here we see that for everybody, there is a cost in switching to a new decision rule than to stay in the same. Now, if this is both requiring a cost, is it the case that multilinguals become better at switching because they are switching a lot? So let's have a look at the brain activity when people are switching between languages. When people switch between languages, these two areas become activated. And when they switch between colors and shapes, then only this tiny bit gets activated. So it's quite strange they get to do such a difficult task with so little activation. But actually, all these areas get activated in both tasks, so they are shared. Therefore, it is suggested that if we train language switching, you might also become better at task switching, because some of these areas are shared between the two tasks. So yes, multilinguals train language switching and can become better at other types of switching. Sometimes we see this in the switch cost decreasing, so basically you become quicker at switching as a bilingual compared to a monolingual, and sometimes this is only seen in the brain activation, so that there's less brain activation needed in bilinguals than monolinguals to switch. But there's not only a difference between bilinguals and monolinguals, the same bilingual also shows differences. So when a bilingual is in a bilingual situation, their switch cost is smaller than when they are in a monolingual situation. And does this bilingualism or multilingualism have some protective effects for the brain? What is suggested is that this is indeed the case, with bilinguals showing the first symptoms of dementia almost 5 years later than monolinguals. The idea is that this comes from something called cognitive reserve, which is the idea that people develop a reserve of thinking abilities. So basically they become better at thinking, their brain becomes more efficient, and then when people get older with normal aging or when there is a disease, this can help you prevent the decline that is seen. So let's summarize. How does multilingualism affect the functioning of the mind and brain? We see that monolinguals need to monitor their environment for language hints. Remember that the Eiffel Tower can indicate French, Obama English, the soup in this case Mandarin or Cantonese. And the exposure to these hints and this general switching or practicing in different languages changes how the brain functions in 3 different ways. We see this enhanced alertness, or this readiness to respond to the cues or hints that are in our environment. It might become easier to switch between tasks or become more flexible in changing what you were doing and what you need to start doing, as well as a later onset of dementia. Now, what does this mean? This means that if students are mixing languages in the classroom, it is not necessarily bad. It doesn't mean that they are confused. It could simply be the case that they are using the hints in the environment to switch the languages accordingly. So maybe there is a student that speaks the other language in the class. Another option is that the student understands that their environment, the people that they're speaking to, understand both languages and therefore they are using it. Therefore, it can actually indicate that using these hints makes people really good at at using their languages, and it's not necessarily confusion that's causing the switching of languages. Another thing that we have mentioned is that the switching between languages or practicing and using different languages may provide training for the brain. And because juggling more than one language or language environment provides this kind of mental exercise to create cognitive reserve to the brain and mind, the brain will change. This also changes with different environments. Now, it doesn't mean that you will see that bilingual students are different than monolingual children, but there are differences in the brain. And then lastly, what it suggests is that using multiple language may create a cognitive reserve and delay symptoms of dementia. It doesn't mean you do not get dementia, but the symptoms will display later. The references used in this presentation can be found here, and of course there are many others to be found.